This could be the first generation of children in the United States that lives less than its parents.
With a growing problem with obesity, heart-related diseases and cancer, many people are beginning to try to educate themselves in the way they eat. Take my incredible parents as an example. My dad has lost 12 kilograms in the past 12 months, and my mum has lost 10 kilograms in the past 12 months, all in the name of health. Veganism is the latest health trend with documentaries such as Forks Over Knives, Cowspiracy, and more recently Game Changers, which have caused quite the stir for societal norms and the animal agriculture industry. In fact, sales in plant-based food has risen 10% in the last year, and between 2014 and 2019, an interest in veganism increased a massive 7-fold. Today, I want to dive into the science behind whether endurance athletes should actually eat meat. So, what is veganism? A vegan is a person who does not eat or use any animal products, including eggs or milk. People may go vegan for many different reasons. There is the ethical side, meaning to prevent the undignified animal suffering, the environmental argument, to protect our incredible planet, especially given that animal agriculture creates more harm on the planet than transport industries combined. What does the science say about endurance athletes? Well, I found out. So I'm going to leave all of the links to every single source that I've looked into in the description box below so that you guys can ultimately do your own research, because at the end of the day this is just the way I interpreted it, and if you want to educate yourself more then by all means I'm not going to discourage that. So the links are below, definitely go and look into them for yourself, but this is the way I read them, and I have 5 different sources here that I'm going to analyse, go into detail. Most of them are pretty recent, but actually one of them is from 1999. So without further ado, let's go. So my first source is a study on the cardiorespiratory fitness and peak torque differences between vegetarian and omnivore endurance athletes, and this was in 2016. So this study analysed 27 vegetarians and 43 omnivores. Now, the one thing I'm going to say is this is a vegetarian analysis. It doesn't go into veganism, but I thought that this was an amazing study just to outline whether or not you actually need meat. And they tested treadmill VO2 max, and they tested strength dynamometer in leg, and I think it was in leg extension. So what the results said were that the protein intake was lower in vegetarians. So the meat eaters actually took in more protein, which I mean, you can understand, but what they did say was that in relation to body mass and the body's regulation, the protein intake was equal. So yes, meat eaters did eat more protein, but in relationship to the mass to like their weight to intake ratio, it was the same. The male VO2 max was found to be the same, and the female VO2 max was slightly higher in omnivores. Now, the one thing I'm going to say on this study is there is only 27 vegetarians and 43 omnivores. So there's more omnivores. 27 isn't a lot of people to test on, so I would say that this study does require more in-depth backing, but obviously with the other studies that I've looked into, it provides a collective data analysis. The peak torque was no difference, but the vegetarians actually had a higher cardiorespiratory fitness than the meat eaters. So their aerobic capacity wasn't compromised and actually was facilitated by not eating meat. An interesting answer, especially just from one study. So far we found out that endurance athletes actually are facilitated by not eating meat. So let's move on to the second source. So again, this is a 2016 study. This is from the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, and it goes into vegetarianism. So again, not veganism, but not eating meat. And I'm going to quote here, appropriately planned vegetarian, including vegan diets are healthful, nutritionally adequate, and may provide health benefits for prevention and treatment of diseases, and it is appropriate through all stages of life. And it also said that vegetarians and vegans are actually at a reduced risk of ischemic heart disease, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, certain cancers and obesity. And obviously this doesn't directly relate to endurance athletes, but in the long run, if you're eating meat, if you are at higher risk of hypertension, heart disease, cancers, obesity, then what does that tell you about the prolonged impact of eating meat on your arteries? And at the end of the day, an endurance athlete is wanting the best artery diameter to increase efficiency of the systems. And at the end of the day, if eating meat does clog up the arteries and does cause increase in type 2 diabetes, heart disease and all of these illnesses, then clearly there's something going on with the relationship to meat and eating meat and how that affects the arteries and the heart and just the general body systems. So with that being said, I think that that's super interesting because increase in heart disease chances means that your arteries are going to be constricted, and at the end of the day you don't want your arteries to be constricted if you're an endurance athlete, because you're relying on the oxygen transfer and the transfer of blood around your system, and that is why endurance athletes tend to be seen as healthy and they tend to be less likely for disease. But at the end of the day, if you're eating meat and that increases your risk of heart disease and hypertension, etc., then is it healthy? And is it the best for your sport and your athletic performance? So my third source is from 1999, and it goes into fitness and vegetarian diets. Again, vegetarian, but it does outline whether or not we should eat meat. And the general conclusion of this study was that there was no detrimental or beneficial effect for vegetarian diets on performance. Now, the one thing I'm going to say is they've said that there's no detrimental effect, but they've also said that there's no beneficial effect. So it doesn't say that it's better or worse, but this was an older study, so at the end of the day there would have been less vegetarian things in the supermarket, and back then vegetarian and veganism looked totally different, especially now with more veganism friendly foods in the supermarkets like corn. And I mean, they would have had corn, but you've literally got a whole aisle in the ready meal section which is plant-based, and you never used to have that before. And obviously I would never condone ready meals, but I think that's a perfect example of how veganism and vegetarianism has expanded. And yes, it said that there's no detrimental effect, but I think it's interesting that it says no beneficial effect. And if the same study was done now, would that still be the same conclusion? So my fourth study, this one is really, really interesting. So this was a 2003 study, and it was on Oxford females, and it went into the diet and body mass index in 38,000 Oxford meat eaters, fish eaters, vegetarians and vegans. So this covers a large amount of people, and there was a lot of limiting factors excluded from this study, which I absolutely love. All of the participants were athletic, all of the participants were lean, all of the participants had similar lifestyles because they limited smoking and other significant lifestyle differences to less than 5%. So I think that this is a really interesting study to look into because it's probably the most scientifically accurate study that there is, based on the quantity of participants, but also the varying factors between the participants. And what this study found, that the highest body mass index was in omnivores, so people who ate meat, and the lowest body mass index was in vegans, which I think is really, really interesting. Obviously, high body mass index is largely associated with heart disease, diabetes, type 2 of course, certain cancers, obesity, things like this. And lower body mass index is generally associated with health and well-being. So I thought that this was a really interesting study, and obviously this doesn't specifically target endurance athletes, but in general it does say that vegans are generally healthier. And yes, that doesn't take into consideration vegan junk food, stuff like that. Like, I could be vegan and live off Pringles, it's still being vegan, but it does take into the consideration that they are generally more aware of what's going into their body. A lot of vegans will look into deficiencies such as B12, and they will look into protein intake more strictly. And I think that being vegan doesn't necessarily mean not eating animals, but I think sometimes it also means that you're slightly more clued up on what you're putting into your body. And from an athletic point of view, I think that this is super important to note. And clearly there are links between eating meat and a higher percentage of obesity, heart disease, and type 2 diabetes and cancer. So clearly eating meat can't be overly healthy if it's causing an increase in these diseases. And as an athlete, you want to be the healthiest you can. You would never find an athlete wanting to get, I mean, you wouldn't find a person wanting to get heart disease, but you would never find an athlete putting something in their body that they know will give them heart disease in the future, if that makes sense. They're very clued up and they want the best energy efficiency, particularly given that they're an endurance athlete. So I've left my last source to be the most recent but also the most interesting. So this is a 2020 study and it's been taken out for 2 years. Now the rest of these were just kind of shorter term studies, so they were very much like just testing meat eating diets versus vegan diets, but this basically took into account a longer period of time. So this is titled, "Is a vegan diet detrimental to endurance and muscular strength?" So this looks into endurance, so key for endurance athletes, but it also goes into muscular strength, which is still important for endurance athletes, but I think is obviously very interesting in terms of sprint athletes. So they studied 56 healthy, lean, active women, and they minimized the age gap, and between the youngest and the oldest there was only an 8.2-year age gap, which I think is really important because they've minimized the external factors that may influence the result. All volunteers were either following a vegan or an omnivore diet for 2 years. So they chose people, and then for 2 years they studied them, they gave them a diet to follow, and then they studied what happened. And there was a 50-50 split. So 28 were given a vegan diet for 2 years and 28 were given a omnivore diet for 2 years. And what the results showed is what I think is so interesting. I mean, first and foremost, they measured so many different factors. They measured anthropometric measurements, they measured body composition, they measured VO2 max, they measured submaximal endurance, they measured muscular strength, and they also measured diet factors, so as in like deficiencies and stuff like that. And what the results showed was super interesting. So both had similar physical activity, body mass index, percentage body fat, lean body mass, and strength. So they all kind of looked the same and had the same strength output, but the vegans had a significantly higher VO2 max and submaximal endurance, which I think is really interesting, particularly in terms of the endurance side of athletics and performance, because if vegans actually had a significantly higher VO2 max and submaximal endurance, then this tends to suggest that it's better for your heart health and the way that the blood is pumped around the body, because at the end of the day, endurance sport is largely controlled by the blood that goes around the body and delivers oxygen to the working muscles. So, with that being said, clearly the arteries and, the cardiac system and the respiratory system kind of work better on a vegan diet. And I think that's super interesting. So the question isn't whether endurance athletes should eat meat. The question is whether or not we need to. And I think looking at those 5 sources, clearly we don't need to. So it's clearly just personal preference. And at the end of the day, this is where I think it's super important to learn, because I used to think that it was necessary to eat meat. And these studies show, the facts and the scientific literature shows that we don't have to eat meat. And if we don't have to eat meat, should we eat it? And obviously this is personal preference, but me personally, I can't condone the suffering of an animal if I don't need it. It's not necessary. It is just clearly a question of taste rather than need. And therefore, is it really, really necessary for me to eat it? You can answer that for yourselves in your lifestyle, but personally, I would say no. We don't need it. It's a luxury. And for me, I think that that's a clear step and a clear reason to at least cut down the meat consumption. If actually my athletic performance, being an endurance athlete, is going to be better by not eating meat, and if an animal has to die and suffer and be caged and live such a horrible life, why should I eat meat? What positives are there for eating meat? I can't think of any. So that is why I have been vegetarian since October. I am going vegan. I am just using up every last bit that isn't vegan in my cupboard, so like protein powder and stuff, just because I don't want it to go to waste. But I am going vegan, and everything I buy that from now on is vegan. So with that being said, I think that this is super important, and I have obviously taken this decision not just based on ethics and environment, but also based on what the scientific literature says about my performance. And just since going vegetarian, I can firmly say that my recovery's been better, my training's been better. I've been probably the fittest I've ever been, and that is insane, the amount of improved muscle mass, improved aerobic capacity that has happened just from making that change from eating meat. And I definitely would encourage people to, obviously don't just go vegan like that, but definitely take the steps. Maybe go vegan 1 day a week and then go vegan 2 days a week, and just build it up from there. Or even go vegetarian first, because at the end of the day, you don't need meat at all. And if you're an athlete like I am, clearly you don't need it, and clearly it's actually detrimenting your performance. So with that being said, I hope that this video has shed some light for you. I wanted to share this video because the scientific literature that I read, I had to share it. I couldn't not. And I think that our planet is our planet, and we have a duty of care to it. And I think that with that being said, I think that people should be more educated in what they're eating. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Please be sure to give this video a thumbs up. Please click the subscribe button below. I post university and sport related videos, and I post every Monday at 11 AM. But make sure you ring the notification bell, because I do every now and again post 2 videos in a week, just as a little extra. So make sure you ring that bell. I also just want to point out, I know this is at the end of the video rather than the start, but I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scientist. This is just what I found. Obviously consult your doctor if you have any queries about changing your diet, but also consult the scientific literature that's in the description box below. With that being said, please share this video, because I think that it's super important to get the movement out there and to share the fact that clearly we don't actually need to eat meat as an athlete. I hope you guys stay safe, and I hope that someday you guys will all be vegan. Bye guys.